day, no North Korean would dare to escape their country, because Kim Jong-un has made it nearly impossible. And a North Korean caught doing so would rather choose to die over what's awaiting back in North Korea. But why are people so desperate to leave North Korea, to the extent that they are even willing to risk their lives for it? And why do they choose China, one of North Korea's closest allies, as their first option to escape? And most importantly, how do North Koreans successfully escape the country? Let's get into all that and more in today's video. You must have heard the stories that North Koreans don't have access to the internet, and there's no freedom, no rights. But in reality, North Korea is actually worse than you think.
People were dying in these hospitals, and rats would eat the eyeballs of the people who were dying, and children who were starving would eat the rats. And then the children would die, and the rats would eat the children.
This was a podcast Joe Rogan did with Yeon-mi Park, who successfully escaped North Korea and exposed the reality of her country.
And my mom goes away to find food. We don't have we don't have phones, we don't have letters. If I say goodbye to her, I don't know when I'm gonna see her again or if I'm ever gonna see her again. Because she could have killed and raped and starved. You just never know how to find people.
So you never went days where you didn't see. This is a normal thing to see dead bodies.
It was every day as normal as breathing the air right now.
On top of that, North Korea ranks 118th out of 127 countries on the Global Hunger Index. 53.5% of the population is undernourished. And almost 60% of North Korea's population lives below the poverty line. These are just a tiny percent of things we've shared. But you need to understand why North Koreans are even ready to die to escape the hell they are living in. When North Koreans make the daring decision to leave their country, they often see China as their first stop on the way to a better life. But why? The answer lies in geography of North Korea. Imagine you are a North Korean and are planning to escape the country. What options could you think of? Well, North Korea shares its land border with China, Russia, and South Korea. Then, in case you decide to escape via waters, you have the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. So, how's Russia then? Well, don't even think about it. Because if you die there, the world would not even know about it. You might think that since North Korea shares a small border with Russia, it could also make an easy route for defectors. But the reality is far different. This border is just 17 kilometers, or about 10.5 miles, short. But despite this fact, it comes with a whole set of hurdles that make the escape almost impossible. First off, the border is heavily monitored. We're not just talking about casual patrols. North Korean border guards are known for their strict enforcement. They're always on the lookout for anyone trying to cross, with orders to shoot them on the spot if someone is attempting to escape. This is way different from the situation at the China-North Korea border, where defectors often find more opportunities to slip through. The border with Russia is under tight security for both nations, largely due to its strategic importance. Now, the North Korean regime doesn't mess around when it comes to controlling its borders. They've built an impressive surveillance network that includes fences, guard posts, and patrol units. High-tech gadgets like motion detectors and cameras are in place to catch any unauthorized movement. And let's not forget about the soldier stationed there. They're fiercely loyal to the regime and hand-picked for their reliability, and bribing them or hoping for a blind eye is pretty much out of the question. On the Russian side, things aren't any better. The Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, is responsible for keeping the border secure, and they have a vested interest in maintaining strong relations with North Korea. They routinely patrol their border, armed with modern technology to spot any defectors trying to cross. Given that the border is so small, it's easier for both governments to maintain tight control. When you compare this to the lengthy China-North Korean border, which spans hundreds of kilometers and features diverse landscapes, the situation at the Russian-North Korea border is a whole different ballgame. It's much more manageable for authorities to monitor it closely. Also, historically, Russia and North Korea have had strong diplomatic ties. This cooperation extends to border security, where the Russian government actively works with North Korea to prevent defectors. They have agreements in place to deport North Korean citizens caught crossing the border illegally. So if a defector gets caught, Russia isn't likely to offer them refuge. Instead, they'll send them back to North Korea, and then you know what happens next. But what happens if a North Korean defector is caught in Russia? The Russian government usually acts quickly, seeking to return these individuals to North Korea, mentioning their international agreements. Unlike some Western nations that might consider asylum claims, Russia doesn't have the same protections in place for North Korean refugees. Human rights organizations have documented numerous tragic cases where defectors were sent back, only to face extreme punishment, including imprisonment in labor camps, torture, and even execution. But let's say luck was on your side, and you somehow managed to dodge all the surveillance and make it into Russian territory. Well, lucky you, you're most likely going to freeze to death. The Siberian region, where North Korea and Russia meet, is known for its brutal weather, especially in the winter, when temperatures often drop to a bone-chilling -40 Celsius, and Fahrenheit, they're the same temperature. And for many North Koreans, who often arrive poorly equipped and malnourished, even staying alive in these conditions is a huge challenge. But somehow, if you tackle the cold, you still have to face Siberia's harsh terrain. The landscape is rugged, filled with dense forests, mountains, and valleys, which will make navigation tough without the right gear or knowledge. Additionally, it's sparsely populated, which means even if someone does manage to cross into Russia, they might find themselves isolated, far from any potential help or shelter. In Siberia, you need a solid plan, survival skills, and supplies, none of which the average North Korean defector has. With the isolation of the region, any setback, like an injury or getting lost, could easily be fatal, as finding assistance is basically impossible. So you might die, starving and freezing, without any help, and the world would be completely unaware of it. But even if you hypothetically manage to tackle these deadly problems, the situation still won't get better for you. There's a complete lack of support networks for defectors in Russia. Unlike China, where underground organizations might assist defectors at great personal risk, Russia doesn't have these networks. Without a support system, defectors in Russia are essentially on their own. Most don't speak Russian, which complicates communication and finding help. So death or deportation is what you will most likely face in the case of Russia. So Russia is clearly not the option. Surprisingly, the best option for you, despite the hell-like situation you might face, is actually China. North Korea shares an extensive 880-mile border with China, which includes rivers, forests, and mountains. You've packed your bags and you've set off for the border, your heart pounding with fear, praying that North Korean authorities don't catch you. But if you get caught trying to escape the country, the best you can hope for is death. Yeah, you heard that right, because the harsh punishments like severe beatings, hard labor, torture, and forced abortions, or even being sent to a political prison camp, would be worse than death. Perhaps that's why Park Hyun-woo and his father were carrying poison with them, just in case they were caught. You might take help from the brokers to help you defect from North Korea to China, but it might also cost you a fortune. Their prices are as high as $13,000 to $15,000 USD per person. And considering the fact that the average North Korean earns around $1,100 USD a year, it's almost impossible for the average North Korean to actually afford that. The amount for defection has increased dramatically since Kim Jong-un assumed power in North Korea in 2012. In fact, they've risen so much that prior to 2012, the cost of a bribe was between $1,780 and $3,500, and as low as $45 in the early 2000s. The reason was that Kim made a policy of death for those involved in defections, and so fewer people in positions of power are willing to risk themselves to help others flee the country. But if you can't find brokers, you have to manage everything yourself. Luckily, you somehow managed to escape North Korea and enter China thinking that you were finally free to breathe freedom. Then let me tell you that this is not even the beginning. The Chinese government agencies maintain tight control over who enters and exits the country, and this includes a strict approach towards North Korean defectors. If North Koreans are caught entering China illegally, they face immediate consequences. Typically, they are arrested, detained, and handed over to the North Korean government. And all of this is because of the 1986 bilateral border protocol between China and North Korea. China considers North Korean defectors as illegal economic migrants, rather than refugees, and forcibly sends them back to North Korea. So getting caught even in China is a nightmare. But you might ask, if not China, where is the final ideal destination then? Well, it's actually much closer to North Korea than you could think of. But to reach there, the next challenge is to escape from the eyes of the dragon. Shockingly, the situation is much worse for women, because a North Korean woman who crosses the border not only has to evade the authorities, but also faces predators waiting to exploit her vulnerability. North Koreans, like Che-ran, was one of many who crossed the border hoping for a better life, only to find herself trapped in an even more exploitative situation. Che-ran fled North Korea in her late teens, not for any grand political reason, but simply to avoid the back-breaking work she'd been assigned at a coal mine. But her hopes for a better future in China were crushed the moment she crossed the river. Instead of freedom, she found herself at the mercy of brokers who profit from the desperation of North Korean defectors. Once in China, Che-ran, like many others, was given a cruel choice: forced work at a bar or marry a stranger. She chose the latter, not because it was an appealing option, but because it felt like the lesser of the evils. What followed was a forced marriage to a man she didn't choose and a life in a remote village where she couldn't even communicate with those around her. It's easy to see why she felt like she didn't exist as a person during those 17 long years. And this is not just an isolated incident. Tens of thousands of North Korean women and girls face similar fates in China. China's one-child policy left the country with far more men than women, creating a black market for brides. Many of these women are sold into marriages where they have no rights, no autonomy, and no escape. Or still, some are forced into prostitution. The reality of their escape is nothing short of modern-day slavery. And life in China for these women is a constant struggle for survival. They live under the radar, without legal status, and are always at risk of becoming discovered by Chinese authorities, who view them as economic migrants rather than refugees. And as we saw, if they get caught, they face deportation back to North Korea, where imprisonment, torture, or worse awaits them. This forces them to live in constant fear, unable to access healthcare, education, or even basic human rights. They are, quite literally, invisible. What's even more heartbreaking is how the very systems these women turn to for help exploit them. Some local Chinese authorities issue residence permits to North Korean women married to Chinese men. But these permits come at a high price, both financially and emotionally. They allow limited freedom of movement, but also place the women under strict government surveillance. But Ran was lucky, and after nearly 2 decades of living in the shadows, she managed to escape China with the help of brokers and church organizations. It wasn't easy. The journey involved crossing multiple countries and spending time in a detention center in Thailand. But eventually, she made it to South Korea, where she was finally able to start a new life. But not everyone is as lucky as Che. On April 26, 2024, China made headlines by forcibly sending back around 60 North Korean refugees. This forced return happened after Kim Jong-un met with Zhao Leji, a top Chinese official. This raised concerns among activists and North Korean escapees, who feared China might start sending back more people due to its closer ties with North Korea, and also because of the 1986 bilateral protocol we heard about earlier. But there's a bit of nuance. China is also a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, as well as the United Nations Convention Against Torture. This means they have a legal and moral obligation not to return anyone who faces persecution or torture, a principle known as non-refoulement. The situation becomes even more troubling when you consider the realities of those who are returned to North Korea, and you know why. One report even said that North Korean security agents publicly executed 13 women and 2 men in the town of Juwon-gu, which is located in Ongsan County in northern Hamgyong Province, right near the border with China. This shocking incident came to light through unnamed sources in a North Korea Today report published by Good Friends, a Buddhist NGO based in South Korea. These executions were carried out on a bridge, and the local residents had no choice but to watch. In fact, Elizabeth Salmon, the UN's expert on human rights in North Korea, shared at a UN meeting that more than 1,000 North Koreans are stuck in China because of closed borders. They're being held indefinitely, unable to move forward or go back. It's a chaotic situation where the North Korean government, amid its strict pandemic measures in the past, has been reluctant to accept its citizens back. The fact that the Chinese government is holding these defectors in detention facilities raises significant humanitarian concerns. In July of 2021, Human Rights Watch reported that around 50 refugees were sent back to North Korea, but that appeared to have been an isolated incident rather than a consistent practice. Since then, there have been many reports of defectors being sent back, adding to the uncertainty of their situation. But China is so ruthless, you can't even imagine. Shin fled North Korea in January of 2020, right before the COVID-19 lockdown. But unfortunately, her escape didn't lead to freedom. It led her straight into the hands of traffickers. She was sold into marriage to an older Chinese man. Things took a dire turn when Shin became pregnant. In a moment of despair, she tried to end her life with an overdose of cold medicine. After that attempt, instead of getting the help she needed, she was arrested by Chinese police and interrogated for months. The U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights has engaged with Chinese diplomats at various platforms, urging them to allow North Korean refugees to settle where they choose. During these discussions, officials from the Chinese government have been polite but largely dismissive of humanitarian concerns. It's like they hear the words, but they don't quite register the weight behind them. But even more frustrating is the Chinese government's refusal to engage in discussions about North Korean escapees with UN officials who deal with refugee issues. While there may have been no issue addressing refugee situations from South Asia or Southeast Asia, North Korean defectors seem to be a different story altogether. This lack of dialogue raises serious questions about how seriously the Chinese government takes the plight of these individuals. As years passed, many activists raised their voices against this, but did it change anything? Peter Young, head of a rights group called Justice for North Korea, has been vocal about the responsibilities of China as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. He's not just talking for the sake of it. He points out that the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea called out China for crimes against humanity almost a decade ago. And here we are, 10 years later, and things are still just as bad. The legal status of North Korean escapees in China makes things even trickier. Without any recognized legal standing, they face battles at every turn. But wait, if there's so much hell in China, can't North Koreans just consider other alternatives? There are still 3 other options left for an escape. In fact, these might be way better options than Russia and maybe even China. For North Koreans that have the required skills, they might consider the waters surrounding North Korea as an escape route, either the Yellow Sea or the Sea of Japan. Escaping via the sea is incredibly difficult, but in 2016, Lee Chul-yeon, a former high-ranking government official working for the North Korean Ministry of State Security, managed to do it with a friend by swimming across the Yellow Sea. He arrived in South Korea after swimming for 8 hours. That sounds like something out of a movie, right? But the truth is, not everyone is fortunate enough to pull off such a daring escape, and that's largely due to the relentless military presence and surveillance along North Korea's coastlines. The North Korean Navy and coastal defense units are always on the lookout. They particularly focus on the western coastlines near the Yellow Sea, which is a well-known route for defectors hoping to make it to South Korea. And remember, these patrols are no joke. They come equipped with advanced radar systems, patrol boats, and guard towers that keep a close eye on any maritime activity. So if you're caught trying to flee by boat or even by a homemade raft, the odds aren't in your favor. Most escapees get arrested on the spot, and when they're returned to North Korea, they face some serious consequences. North Korean authorities have beefed up their coastal defenses with multiple layers of security. You'll find lookout towers, barbed wire fences, and military checkpoints placed along the coast. And let's not forget about the local fishermen and residents. Anyone caught helping defectors faces harsh penalties. So for anyone trying to get close to the coastline unnoticed, it's almost an impossible task, let alone actually launching a boat without getting detected. Now, if you think you can slip into the waters and make it to safety, there's another huge challenge waiting for you on the other side. South Korea isn't just sitting back and letting anyone cross the maritime border. They've got their own robust system of coastal defenses, especially along the western coast, where the maritime border is pretty much a flashpoint. The South Korean military is always monitoring the seas, looking out for any unauthorized crossings. This is because the risk of infiltration by North Korean spies or military personnel is a constant concern for them. Their naval forces patrol the waters along what's called the Northern Limit Line, or NLL, which is the de facto boundary between the two Koreas in the Yellow Sea. And then there's the unpredictable nature of the Yellow Sea itself. This body of water can be pretty treacherous, with strong currents and tidal forces that make it a nightmare for anyone trying to navigate through. If you're on a small boat or a makeshift raft, these currents can easily throw you off course or even sweep you right back into North Korean waters. It's not just about having a boat. You really need proper navigation equipment and experience to make it across. For many defectors who are inexperienced and lack the right gear, the rough seas can quickly turn into a life-or-death situation. So, what other options are there? Can't we just cross the border somehow and reach South Korea? That would have been the easiest option if it wasn't for the DMZ. For many North Koreans, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, might look like a tempting route to freedom. After all, it directly separates North and South Korea. However, attempting to cross the DMZ is arguably one of the least feasible escape options out there, even for the extremely lucky ones. But why? The DMZ is a 250-kilometer, about 155-mile long, and 4-kilometer, or 2.5-mile wide, heavily guarded border between North Korea and South Korea. It acts as a buffer zone to prevent direct fighting between the two countries, and despite its name, it is ironically one of the most heavily militarized areas in the world. It is packed with thousands of troops, landmines, and a ton of surveillance, making it nearly impossible for an average North Korean to cross. On the other side, you've got the North Korea's People's Army, the KPA, keeping a watchful eye, while on the southern side, South Korea and US armed forces are on constant alert. This continuous military presence makes any unauthorized crossing not just risky, but potentially life-threatening. And if you are thinking of some risky stunts to cross the border, it might be the worst idea. On the North Korean side, the soldiers are heavily armed and given very clear orders. Shoot anyone attempting to defect. They don't mess around. The DMZ is fortified with advanced surveillance technology, including motion sensors, night vision cameras, and infrared detectors, all aimed at detecting any movement within or near the border. North Korean soldiers patrol the area regularly, making it almost impossible for anyone to approach the DMZ without getting shot. This shoot-to-kill policy has been in place for decades, resulting in countless incidents where soldiers have opened fire on individuals trying to escape. It's a major obstacle that makes crossing the DMZ incredibly difficult. On the South Korean side, the DMZ is just as fortified. With backing from the United States, South Korea maintains a constant military presence along the southern part of the border. These forces are always on high alert, especially given the ongoing tensions with the North. Adding to the risk, the DMZ is littered with an estimated 1 to 2 million landmines, laid by both North and South Korean forces during and after the Korean War. These landmines are placed in areas where people might try to escape, making the zone extremely dangerous to cross. They're buried underground and can be tricky to detect, even for those familiar with the terrain. For defectors without the right equipment or training, crossing a minefield is pretty much a death wish. The landmines can be triggered by the slightest misstep. Tragically, many who tried to escape through the DMZ have lost their lives in explosions, often due to a lack of proper planning. To make matters worse, there are barbed wire fences stretching across the DMZ. And these aren't just some average fences, they're electrified and designed to prevent anyone from slipping in or out undetected. Even if someone manages to avoid the guards and navigate the landmines, climbing these fences is a whole new challenge. They're built to be almost impossible to scale, with sharp barbs that make cutting through them extremely difficult. On top of all of this, both North and South Korea have set up numerous surveillance cameras and motion sensors along the DMZ that are capable of picking up even the tiniest movements and can quickly alert nearby soldiers. These surveillance systems are highly advanced and run 24/7, making it almost impossible for anyone to slip through even at night. But despite the overwhelming obstacles, there have been a few rare cases where individuals have successfully crossed the DMZ. One of the most notable incidents happened in November of 2017, when a North Korean soldier named Oh Chung-song made a dramatic escape. He was stationed near the Joint Security Area, or JSA, the only part of the DMZ where North and South Korean soldiers stand face to face. On October 13th, 2017, he made the bold choice to defect. He drove a military vehicle towards the border, but his escape did not go unnoticed. North Korean soldiers opened fire, hitting him multiple times before he managed to cross into South Korean territory. This was the real footage of him escaping North Korea. So now you know why China is considered to be the best option as to escape North Korea. But China is not the end destination. After all the struggles the escapees go through to get into China, their ultimate goal is to reach South Korea. Or I would say the South Korean embassy in any country initially. Technically, even China is an option, but only if you somehow manage to dodge the authorities and directly reach the South Korean embassy in China. Although it might be almost an impossible task because of China's surveillance and the risk of being intercepted before arrival. At this point, your options become limited. You need to seek out countries that are more sympathetic to the plight of North Korean defectors. And if you think that crossing the Chinese border and reaching one of its neighboring countries is the final goal, then you need to rethink. Ending up in the wrong country could mean being sent right back to North Korea again. And reaching a country like that is the biggest challenge, especially since there aren't many nearby options around China. Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar all maintain a close relationship with North Korea and are more likely to deport you to North Korea than South Korea. In fact, Laos has even handed over North Korean defectors back to North Korea in the past, and the Vietnamese government has previously returned North Korean defectors to Chinese officials, who promptly returned them to North Korea. If you're thinking about making it to India, Bhutan, Nepal, or Pakistan, you have to trek through the Himalayas, a journey that's incredibly tough and offers no guarantee that you'll actually make it. So you are left with two friendly and realistic nearby destinations to escape that are either Mongolia or Thailand. Mongolia is a closer option, and its government is supportive of North Korean defectors. Upon arrival, you just have to surrender yourself to the Mongol police, and they will deport you to South Korea rather than the north. But the only problem is that to get there, one must cross the unforgiving Gobi Desert. This vast and hostile terrain is freezing, filled with dangerous wildlife, and has scarce resources for survival. And navigating it requires a lot of skills that most North Koreans wouldn't have learned back home. Despite these facts, some of them still make it to Mongolia and ultimately to freedom in South Korea. And the most famous example of this is Yeonmi Park. She has a YouTube channel, and maybe you must have even seen her on the podcast and the shows she's went on. Anyways, considering these challenges with Mongolia, you might want to choose Thailand as your savior. But unfortunately, even this route comes with its own set of challenges and risks. Firstly, you have to make your way from the North Korean border with China all the way down to the Chinese border with Laos or Myanmar, and that too all while evading detection by the authorities. To reach Thailand, you'll first need to cross the mountainous terrain of China's Yunnan province and navigate the dense, dangerous jungles of Laos or Myanmar, since China and Thailand don't share a border. Finally, you'll have to cross the dangerous Mekong River to reach safety in Thailand, and all the way to South Korea from there. But would North Koreans only want to go to South Korea? South Korea officials state that under South Korea's constitution, all Koreans on the Korean peninsula, including North Koreans, are considered South Korean citizens by default, and are generally entitled to South Korean citizenship. Getting citizenship is fine, but how will the person survive there without a home and a job? For this, South Korea helps them settle in by giving them 8 million Korean won as basic support, and up to 25 million Korean won for job training or for getting a job. On top of that, they also offer 16 million Korean won for housing and help with renting apartments. They get free healthcare, career counseling, and even help for going to college. Even the employers are encouraged to hire them with subsidies of up to 500,000 Korean won per worker. The refugees are taught how to adjust to life in South Korea. Another advantage is the language. The two Koreas share the same language with only very subtle differences. So North Koreans do not need to learn a whole new language when they arrive in South Korea. Fun fact, not every non-Korean will get Korean citizenship as easily as a North Korean. In fact, for foreigners, obtaining South Korean citizenship is much more challenging. It typically requires fulfilling stringent requirements, such as extended residency, language proficiency, or marrying a South Korean national. But why is the same process so easy for a North Korean? South Korea's acceptance of North Korean defectors is so much more than just a legal or political matter. It's also about a shared history and culture. North and South Koreans have a long connection. Typically, it all began long before North Korea was even on the map as we know it today. People lived on the Korean peninsula for thousands of years, developing their own language, culture, and identity. But things took a sharp turn in 1910, when Japan colonized Korea, effectively ending the centuries-old Chosun dynasty. Japan's control wasn't just political, it was cultural domination, an attempt to erase Korean traditions and replace them with Japanese customs. And Koreans, naturally, didn't take this lying down. Resistance popped up everywhere, both in Korea and beyond its borders in China. Then came 1945. Japan's defeat in World War II could have marked Korea's long-awaited independence, but the Cold War began, and instead brought a new wave of challenges to Korea's history. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel by two emerging superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, as a temporary measure to manage the surrender of Japanese forces. But this one thing changed everything for Korea. But like a lot of temporary political decisions, it became permanent, and the fall of Korea began. The Soviets took control of the North, while the US backed the South. And just like that, one people, one culture was split into two very different political entities. By 1948, things escalated. Both the North and the South claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. In the South, Syngman Rhee announced the Republic of Korea, and in the North, Kim Il-sung, who was backed by the Soviets, declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. These two leaders had drastically different versions for Korea's future. The tensions between these two was intense, and there was no sign that it would would ease anytime soon. And as expected, things boiled over to outright war in June of 1950. Kim Il-sung was convinced that he could reunify Korea under his rule and launched a surprise attack on South Korea. The Korean War was brutal. The US, along with UN forces, intervened to support the South, while China jumped in to back the North. The war raged on until 1953, leaving cities in ruins, millions dead, and families torn apart across the divide of the 38th parallel. And even though an armistice, which is basically a formal agreement between two countries at war to stop fighting for a particular time, was signed, the war technically never ended. Even to date, North and South Korea are still divided by the DMZ, one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world, as we saw. But the post-war reality of North Korea was something nobody would believe. Post-war North Korea wasn't the isolated, struggling state we think of today. For a while, North Korea's economy actually outpaced the South's. Kim Il-sung had set up a centralized Soviet-style economy with state control over nearly everything. The country focused on heavy industrialization, and Kim Il-sung introduced juche, a self-reliance ideology that became the core of the North Korean identity. Pyongyang was rebuilt with grand monuments, and Kim Il-sung became larger than life, a father figure of the nation. But not everything was as rosy as it seemed. Kim Il-sung's regime introduced something called songbun, which categorizes people based on their perceived loyalty to the regime. It simply means that the more loyal you are to the regime, or to be more accurate, the more loyal the regime considers you are to them, the more benefits you would get. It was like an invisible ranking system that determined everything from what jobs you could have, where you could live, and what kind of education your children could get. In fact, it wasn't just you who was affected. Your family, for generations, could be stuck in a certain class because of your songbun status. And the same nation who used to progress faster than South Korea started to fall. By the 1970s, the cracks started to show. After the war, North Korea rebuilt quickly, but over time, the system started to fail. The government's strict control and focus on ideology couldn't keep the economy growing. North Korea relied heavily on help from the Soviet Union and other communist countries. But when those countries began struggling, North Korea's economy suffered too. And by the 1980s, living conditions stopped improving, and it was very clear the country was in serious trouble. Then came the 1990s, and things took a sharp turn for the worse. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, cutting off North Korea's biggest ally and economic supporter. And without this crucial backing, North Korea's command economy fell apart, leaving the country in a deep crisis. Agriculture was poorly managed, and natural disasters made everything worse. By the time Kim Il-sung died in 1994, North Korea was in the middle of a full-blown famine. A famine that lasted for a whopping 4 years, from 1994 to 1998. During this famine, Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, took over the nation, and this was during one of North Korea's darkest chapters. The famine, known as the Arduous March, claimed the lives of an estimated 1 million people due to starvation, about 5% of North Korea's population. The government failed to meet basic needs of its people, forcing many to survive by foraging for food or selling whatever they could on the black market. Kim Jong-il responded with a military-first policy, ensuring that the military and political elite get priority access to resources while the general population continued to suffer. Interestingly, this period also marked the rise of illegal markets in North Korea. Although technically forbidden, these black markets became the lifeline for many North Koreans. Over time, they evolved into semi-official spaces where people could buy and trade goods freely, an extraordinary development in North Korea's tightly controlled state. Kim Jong-il stayed in power until his death in 2011, when his son, Kim Jong-un, stepped in. Kim Jong-un was a bit of a mystery when he took over. He was young, in his late 20s, and largely unknown to the North Korean people. But it didn't take long for him to consolidate power. He purged top officials, solidified his authority, and tightened control over the country. Under Kim Jong-un, North Korea has continued to focus on military power, especially its nuclear program, which has brought the country into constant conflict with the international community, particularly the USA. In contrast, South Korea took a bold step that redefined its approach to the divided peninsula. In 1948, South Korea adopted its constitution, according to which it guarantees citizenship to all Koreans, saying that anyone of Korean descent is automatically considered a citizen, regardless of where they live or which government they fall under. Now, this legal framework isn't just about granting citizenship. It also strengthens the idea of a unified Korean identity, and that's incredibly important, given the emotional and historical weight of that division. For many South Koreans, North Korean defectors aren't just immigrants looking for a safe haven, they're seen as fellow Koreans returning to their ancestral homeland. The South Korean Nationality Act also played an important role here. It automatically recognizes North Korean defectors as citizens as soon as they set foot in South Korea. And let's not not forget the humanitarian aspect of this whole situation. Because North Korea is all about control and oppression, while South Korea is a democracy that values freedom and human rights. So when people escape North Korea, South Korea feels a responsibility to step in and help, which almost feels like a moral duty. They see it as offering a lifeline to fellow Koreans who've suffered and just want a chance at a better life. And even these North Korean refugees then raise their voices for the rights of the people. For example, Yeonmi Park escaped North Korea in 2007 at the age of 13, alongside her mother. Their journey was full of uncertainty, involving a harrowing passage through China before they ultimately reached South Korea. Yeonmi Park is one of the most well-known defectors to come forward to raise voices for them. She became a prominent advocate for human rights, dedicated to raising awareness about the struggles faced by defectors. Her speeches at global events like the United Nations and the One Young World Summit have inspired many, as she has highlighted the struggles of those still living under the North Korean regime. In her memoir, In Order to Live, she shares the challenges of her escape and the impact of years spent under strict control and propaganda, and it has some harsh realities faced by North Koreans. Similarly, Hyun-seo Lee defected from North Korea at the age of 17 in 1997. After facing numerous hardships during her journey, she successfully reached South Korea in 2008. Since her arrival, Hyun-seo has prioritized her education and has emerged as a significant advocate for North Korean defectors and often shares her experiences through various media outlets. Even other North Korean defectors have started to make their voices heard, and in ways that the world is beginning to take seriously. For years, these defectors have been telling their stories, not just for their own healing, but to shed light on the brutal realities of life inside of North Korea. For years, the regime kept things tightly under wraps, and outsiders have had very little idea about what is really happening inside. But defectors have been pulling back the curtain, showing the world what life under one of the most oppressive regimes in modern history is really like. And one of these was forced labor camps. Defectors have come forward with stories of people being sent to these camps for the smallest of offenses, such as questioning the regime or simply not showing enough loyalty. And these camps are brutal, with conditions that are nothing short of a nightmare for a person surviving there. In fact, many people never make it out alive. Such stories from these defectors aren't just coming from people who have heard about the camps, they've survived it, and now they're telling the world. In 2002, Jin Kyung-suk successfully defected over to South Korea, becoming a citizen and married a South Korean man. 2 years later, for their honeymoon in 2004, they decided to travel back to the Chinese-North Korean border. But there, unidentified men kidnapped Jin and dragged her back into North Korea while she was trying to acquire video footage about North Korean opium cultivation. She was sent to a concentration camp where she was tortured and eventually executed. It's not easy for a North Korean defector, even if they are well settled. Many still have family members in North Korea, and speaking out could put them in danger. But despite these dangers involved, these defectors keep speaking out because they believe that sharing the truth is the first step towards creating real change. But what makes the situation worse for future North Korean defectors are these numbers we saw in the intro. As of 2023, the number of North Korean defectors has dropped 96.6% to just 99 from a peak of 2,914 in the year 2009. Now, it obviously doesn't mean the North Koreans are happy and no longer want to escape the regime. One of the major reasons for this drop is Kim Jong-un implemented strict measures against defectors, including the death penalty for those involved in organizing or assisting escapes. And that's why you'll also see a sharp drop in the number of defectors after 2012, which was the same year when Kim Jong-un assumed power in North Korea. The next sharp drop was after 2019, and the reason was the move North Korea made during the pandemic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the North Korean regime built new barriers along the China-North Korea border, which involves an outer and inner wall with a buffer zone in between, as you can see in this picture. The craziest part is the North Korean soldiers are ordered to shoot anyone crossing the border without permission, and things are just getting crazier for anyone wanting to exit the dictatorship. In fact, to move within the country itself, North Koreans need official permits, which are also difficult to obtain. Today, every North Korean is facing the punishment for the crime they have committed, the crime of being born in North Korea.